When you think of the 1400s, what comes to mind? Christopher Columbus, the Renaissance, kings and castles in Europe. But what about Africa? For most people, it's a blank page. No cities, no scholars, no civilization, just silence. As if Africans weren't even part of history yet. But what if I told you that silence was by design? Before we unveil what Africans were really doing in 1490, before the ships, before the chains, let's look at the rest of the world, starting with the so-called New World, America. Long before Columbus would set foot in the Caribbean, long before European flags were planted on native soil, the Americas were not wild, unclaimed frontiers. They were home to civilizations, deep, complex, and ancient. In Central America, the mighty Aztec Empire flourished under the rule of Emperor Ahuitzotl. Great stone temples kissed the sky, and human hearts were offered in rituals meant to sustain the universe. In South America, the Inca Empire, stretching from what is now Ecuador to Chile, held its breath in the heights of the Andes, ruling through an intricate system of roads, storage houses, and messengers who ran like the wind. And nestled in the sacred valley near Cusco lived a family, the Calisaya family. Each morning, Tika Calisaya, mother of 4, woke before the sun. She placed maize and potatoes near the fire and offered coca leaves to the mountain spirits. Her husband, Yupanqui, returned from tending the irrigation canals. Their oldest son, Inti, trained with the local warriors, while their daughter, Mama Oklo, practiced weaving stories into the vibrant textiles of her people. To them, the world was ordered, sacred, balanced. But change was stirring, quietly from the east. Across the ocean, Europe was vibrating with transformation. The Renaissance, a rebirth of classical knowledge, was in full bloom. Artists like Leonardo da Vinci and Sandro Botticelli painted visions of beauty and science. Monarchs schemed, kingdoms warred, and rumors of new routes to Asia danced on the lips of explorers. In Spain, Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand were finalizing plans to send an Italian sailor named Christopher Columbus westward, chasing a dream of spices and gold. And in the quiet countryside of Tuscany, Italy, lived the De Luca family. Giovanni De Luca, a parchment maker, dipped his fingers into fresh ink, transcribing ancient Latin texts. His wife, Elena, read passages from a book by Plato, recently translated and printed. Their daughter, Sophia, longed to see the cities of Florence and Rome, where scholars debated ideas once buried by time. But now, we shift our gaze to a land often missing from these stories, a land often overlooked, but never forgotten. Africa. In the 1490s, Africa was not sleeping. It was alive with empires and city-states. The Songhai Empire ruled the Sahel. The Kingdom of Kongo thrived in Central Africa. And in the forests of West Africa, a city stood proudly, surrounded by deep moats and walls that rivaled those in Europe. Benin, known today as southern Nigeria. This was the Kingdom of Benin, where the Oba, king, reigned from a palace of coral and bronze. Streets were laid out in precise grids. Trade flourished with North Africa and the Portuguese, who had just begun their voyages along the coast. This was no kingdom in isolation. Benin's envoys met Portuguese sailors. Its art was exchanged for coral beads and cloth. Its architecture stood tall, its people dignified, its legacy profound. While ships were being readied in Lisbon and empires were clashing in Europe and Asia, Africa was rising. So before we tell you what came after, the ships, the encounters, the changes, let us pause. Let us ask a question that history often forgets. What were Africans doing in 1400? So, Sit back, because this is Africa Unveiled. Before we dive in, I know many of you are watching from around the world, united by a love for Africa. Drop a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. I'll be in the comments engaging with you. And if you're enjoying the content, a like and subscription would truly mean the world to me. All right, let's get back to the video. Let's begin by placing this story within its proper historical context. Today, it is broadly accepted that Christopher Columbus was not the first to cross the Atlantic Ocean, nor was he the first to imagine lands beyond the western horizon of Europe. We now recognize that other civilizations, the Vikings, and possibly the Polynesians, and even the Chinese, had navigated vast oceans long before Columbus set sail. Yet one possibility remains strikingly absent from mainstream historical discourse, that Africans too may have crossed the Atlantic centuries before Columbus. According to both oral traditions and medieval records, an African emperor, Abubakar II, the ninth Mansa of the Mali Empire, is believed to have led an ambitious expedition across the Atlantic around 1311 CE, nearly 200 years before Columbus. The ultimate fate of Abubakar's voyage remains unknown, but the expedition itself is not legend. It was recorded by the 14th century Arab-Egyptian scholar Shihab al-Umari, who interviewed Mansa Musa, Abubakar's successor, during Musa's famed pilgrimage to Mecca in 747, 1324. Curious about how Musa came to power, al-Umari documented his response. "The ruler who preceded me did not believe that the ocean which encircles the earth was without limit. He was determined to find its end. So, he assembled 200 ships filled with men, and 200 more loaded with gold, water, and provisions, to last for years. He instructed the fleet not to return until they had reached the end of the ocean, or had exhausted their resources. Only one ship ever returned. When its captain was summoned, he described a haunting scene. We traveled for a long time until we came upon a vast river in the sea, a powerful current. I was the last in the fleet. I saw the other ships ahead get pulled into a whirlpool and vanish. I barely escaped with my life and turned back." Unwilling to accept defeat, Abubakar resolved to lead the next expedition himself. He relinquished the throne to Musa, commissioned 2,000 ships, 1,000 for his men, 1,000 for supplies, and set sail westward across the Atlantic. He was never seen again. While this story has often been dismissed or ignored in Western historical scholarship, evidence suggests that Columbus may have been aware of such accounts. On his third voyage, Columbus wrote in his journal that one of his aims was to investigate rumors that African traders in canoes had been seen sailing west from the coast of Guinea, and that dark-skinned people had been encountered in the Caribbean, particularly on the island of Hispaniola. According to the Taino people, these visitors came from the south and southeast, bearing metal-tipped spears made of guanin, an alloy of gold, silver, and copper, identical in composition to metals commonly used in West African metallurgy. It is also important to remember that Columbus and the Iberians were not strangers to Africa. By 1492, Spain had just completed the Reconquista, ending more than 700 years of Moorish rule. During that time, the Moors, Muslims of North African origin, had introduced vast intellectual and scientific knowledge to the Iberian Peninsula, including advances in navigation, astronomy, mathematics, and maritime technology. Columbus, far from being an accidental adventurer, was likely influenced, directly or indirectly, by this legacy. He sailed with the benefit of a world already shaped by African and Arab exploration. In light of this, the story of Mansa Abubakar II deserves not only to be remembered, but to be studied and re-evaluated as a significant and potentially transformative chapter in the global history of exploration. Now, with that context established, one might ask, what was happening in the rest of Africa around 1400s? In the heart of West Africa, where the Niger River bends like a gentle arm cradling the land, lay the Mali Empire, a civilization that, by the early 1400s, stood as one of the most admired powers in the world. Its territory spread across what we now call Mali, Senegal, and Guinea. But back then, it was a kingdom of gold, intellect, and influence. Though its most legendary ruler, Mansa Musa, had died just a few decades earlier, in 1337, his legacy still lingered like incense in the air. People from as far as the Middle East, North Africa, and Europe whispered his name, Musa, the man who made gold rain in Cairo, whose pilgrimage to Mecca dazzled the world and collapsed economies with his generosity. But Mali was much more than gold. At its heart was the bustling capital of Niani, a city near the Niger River, known for its bustling markets, thriving culture, and organized governance. Mali was a well-oiled machine, where judges, governors, and ministers helped the emperor run one of the most advanced administrative systems in pre-modern Africa. And then there was Timbuktu. Timbuktu. To many in the Western world, the name sounds mythical, almost imaginary. But in the 1400s, Timbuktu was very real and very powerful. It was home to Sankore University, a center of learning with libraries full of manuscripts, not from foreigners, but from Black African scholars. These handwritten books covered medicine, astronomy, mathematics, law, history, grammar, and theology. Thousands of students came from across the Islamic world to study under African professors in Timbuktu and Jenne, another intellectual hub of the empire. They debated philosophy, they charted stars, they recorded medical procedures, and they did all this in Arabic, Fulani, Soninka, and other native languages. In this time, to be a scholar in Mali was to hold high status. Books were worth more than gold. Knowledge was wealth. So the next time someone asks, did Africa have writing? Tell them about Timbuktu. Tell them about Sankore. Tell them that before Gutenberg printed his first Bible in Europe, Black African scholars were copying, binding, and exchanging books across the Sahara. But Mali was not just about intellect. It was a trading powerhouse. Salt from the Sahara, gold from the forests of bamboo, ivory, kola nuts, and cloth all passed through its cities, traded with Berber merchants, Egyptians, Tunisian caravans, and even Venetian traders from Europe. Mali's control over the trans-Saharan trade routes meant it was not only wealthy, it was strategic. This was not a people waiting to be discovered. This was a civilization defining itself, proudly, powerfully, and brilliantly. Yet beyond the trade, beyond the libraries and universities, the empire was deeply spiritual. Islam had been embraced, but traditional African beliefs remained, creating a society of tolerance, fusion, and spiritual diversity. The emperor was both a secular ruler and a moral leader, responsible for the welfare of his people in this life and the next. And women? They weren't locked away. Historical accounts speak of women in marketplaces, owning property, influencing politics, and taking part in intellectual life. A stark contrast to what many might assume about Islamic societies of the time. This is Mali, the empire of kings and scholars, of traders and builders, the empire that proved that long before colonialism, Black Africa was not in darkness. It was a guiding light. And as Mali stood tall in the 1400s, other civilizations across Africa were also reaching their peaks. Let's now journey south to a kingdom built of stone and pride. Now, we journey south, beyond the Sahara, beyond the savannas, into the highlands of what is today Zimbabwe, where long before any Europeans stepped foot here, Africans were carving their names into stone and into eternity. This is the story of Great Zimbabwe, a civilization so mysterious and magnificent, its ruins still baffle archaeologists and stir wonder in every African heart. In the 1400s, Great Zimbabwe was at its peak, a bustling city with a population of nearly 20,000 people. That may not seem huge today, but at the time, it was one of the largest and most influential cities in sub-Saharan Africa. Its name, Zimbabwe, comes from the Shona phrase Zimba Zimbabwe, meaning houses of stone. And that's no metaphor. The structures here weren't made of mud or wood. They were built with massive granite blocks, carefully stacked without any mortar. Just pure precision, geometry, and architectural genius. The most iconic of these is the Great Enclosure, a circular wall that stretches over 250 meters in circumference, with some walls standing over 11 meters high. No colonial architect built this. No foreign engineer. This was African engineering. This was Black brilliance. But Great Zimbabwe wasn't just about stunning architecture. It was a trading empire. Located strategically between gold-rich regions inland and the trade routes to the Swahili coast, Zimbabwe became a vital player in a global network. Through rivers and overland trails, traders moved gold, ivory, and cattle toward the eastern ports, where goods were shipped to Arabia, Persia, India, and even China. Archaeologists digging at Great Zimbabwe have unearthed Chinese porcelain, Persian glassware, Arab coins, and beads from India, all confirming that Black Africans were trading globally, long before colonial ships arrived. And they weren't exporting raw materials only. They were also refining gold, creating intricate jewelry, and managing complex economies tied to both agriculture and commerce. So, when we hear that Africa was isolated, we must ask, how did Chinese porcelain end up here? How did Arab coins reach Zimbabwe? The answer is simple. Africans were not waiting for the world. They were already part of it. Politically, the rulers of Great Zimbabwe, likely from the Rosvi or Gokomere cultures, governed with structured leadership, religious authority, and control over tribute from smaller communities. They didn't just lead. They were seen as sacred kings, mediators between the spirit world and their people. And yes, women played key economic and spiritual roles here too, as traders, ritual leaders, and family heads. But why was it abandoned? Historians believe that by the late 1400s to early 1500s, overpopulation, declining soil fertility, and changing trade routes led to its gradual decline. Yet, its legacy lived on through oral traditions, cultural practices, and the stone architecture that still stands today. In fact, when European colonists stumbled upon the ruins centuries later, they refused to believe that Black Africans could have built something so advanced. They created wild theories, attributing the walls to Phoenicians, Arabs, even lost tribes of Israel. Everyone but the people whose ancestors still lived nearby. They couldn't believe it because they didn't want to, but we believe it, and we know better now. Because this was not a forgotten corner of Africa. This was the beating heart of Southern innovation, identity, and pride. But while Great Zimbabwe ruled the inland trade along the coast, another African story was unfolding, of ships, spices, cities, and sea breezes. We've seen the empires of the West and the monuments of the South. Now let's turn east, to the golden coastlines of what is today Kenya, Tanzania, Mozambique, and Somalia, where African kingdoms kissed the sea and looked out across the world. Welcome to the Swahili City-States, a chain of wealthy, cosmopolitan African city kingdoms that flourished along the East African coast during the 1400s. Names like Kilwa Kisiwani, Zanzibar, Mombasa, Malindi, and Sofala may not often appear in textbooks, but in their time, these cities were vital global ports, trading with Arabia, Persia, India, China, and beyond. Yes, centuries before the colonizers came, Black Africans had already built international ports, elegant cities, and sea-based economies. These were no fishing villages. These were global players. Let's begin with Kilwa Kisiwani, located in present-day Tanzania. In the 1400s, Kilwa was the jewel of the coast, so wealthy and influential that it controlled trade routes far inland. Gold from Great Zimbabwe, ivory from the forests, and enslaved captives from local conflicts were shipped out through Kilwa in exchange for textiles, ceramics, glassware, incense, and spices. Kilwa's rulers built palaces, stone mosques, and sprawling markets using coral stone. In fact, its Great Mosque, built in the 11th century and expanded by the 14th, is one of the oldest standing mosques in Africa, testament to the early and deep presence of Islam on the continent. When a Portuguese explorer arrived at Kilwa in the late 1400s, he described it as one of the most beautiful and sophisticated cities he had ever seen. The people of the Swahili coast spoke Swahili, a Bantu language infused with Arabic, and lived in societies where African, Arab, Persian, and Indian influences blended seamlessly, not through colonization, but through trade, marriage, and diplomacy. Islam had spread along these coasts through African agency, not conquest. But make no mistake, these were African civilizations, not Arab colonies. The ruling families, merchants, and communities were Black Africans, many of whom had intermarried with foreigners and adopted global practices without ever surrendering their identity. And it wasn't just Kilwa. In Zanzibar, known today as Tanzania, clove and spice trade blossomed. Mombasa, known today as Kenya, became a naval and mercantile powerhouse. Malindi welcomed Chinese envoys from the famous Songhai, whose fleet sailed the Indian Ocean decades before Columbus dreamed of the Atlantic. Sofala, known today as Mozambique, became a southern gateway for gold from the interior. These city-states defy every stereotype about pre-colonial Africa. They had stone buildings, cosmopolitan culture, diplomacy, merchant classes, Islamic courts, and multi-ethnic societies that thrived on African initiative, not foreign control. Women also held power in Swahili culture. They were involved in trade, owned property, and shaped social life. Many were respected as matriarchs in complex coastal lineages. But by the late 1400s, a storm was approaching. The arrival of the Portuguese, armed with cannons and imperial ambitions, would soon disrupt the Indian Ocean peace. But before the colonial tide, before the warships and the greed, there was this: a coastal civilization of Black excellence rooted in trade, culture, and ocean winds. This was Africa, not hidden, not behind, not waiting to be discovered, but standing at the crossroads of the world. And deep in Central Africa, another kingdom was rising, with structured cities, royal courts, and powerful kings: the Kingdom of Kongo. As the Swahili coast hummed with global trade, deep in the heart of Central Africa, another power was rising, one that would command vast territories, build structured cities, and impress even the earliest European envoys who dared to venture inland. Welcome to the Kingdom of Kongo. Situated in what is today northern Angola, Western Democratic Republic of Congo, and parts of the Republic of Congo, the Kingdom of Kongo emerged in the 14th century and was thriving by the 1400s. At its heart was the capital city, Mbanza, Congo. Far from a collection of huts or tribes, Mbanza, Congo was a planned urban center with wide roads, government buildings, a king's court, and even neighborhoods that served as embassies for visiting dignitaries. The Mani Kongo, the king, was not a mere tribal chief. He was a sovereign ruler presiding over a confederation of provinces, each ruled by governors who paid tribute and sent soldiers to the capital. He ruled with the help of a cabinet of advisors, many of whom were drawn from noble families and educated elite. The kingdom had laws, tax systems, bureaucratic record-keeping, and organized diplomacy. Even judicial systems were in place, where disputes could be escalated from local chiefs to provincial councils to the royal court itself. This was Africa before colonization, governed by its own structures, powered by its own intellect, and rooted in its own traditions. The people of Congo lived in well-organized villages and towns. Their houses were made of wood and straw, arranged in neat rows. Local economies were diverse, featuring ironworking, weaving, pottery, salt production, agriculture, and regional trade. You see, the people were not simply surviving. They were creating, innovating, and governing themselves with pride. Trade routes linked the interior to the coast, allowing goods like copper, raffia cloth, ivory, and salt to flow outward. Congo's wealth and organization made it one of the most powerful states in Central Africa by the time Europeans arrived in the late 1400s. And then came the first contact. In 1483, Portuguese explorer Diogo Cao arrived at the mouth of the Congo River. He was welcomed by Congo officials. Soon after, diplomatic relations were established between Congo and Portugal, not as conqueror and subject, but as equals. The Mani Kongo at the time, Nzinga a Nkuwu, even sent ambassadors to Lisbon and received missionaries. By the early 1500s, his son, Afonso I, would become one of the first African monarchs to convert to Christianity, using European ideas strategically while maintaining African power. But this is where the story begins to turn, slowly, subtly. What began as diplomacy would soon become exploitation. The Portuguese, seeing the richness of the land, began pushing for more than trade. They began demanding captives. Slavery, once a minor internal practice, became weaponized, exported, industrialized. Yet even then, Afonso I wrote numerous letters to the King of Portugal, denouncing the illegal slave trading and the corruption of Congo society by foreign greed. The Kingdom of Kongo stood as a powerful example of African agency, diplomacy, and state building before European domination. For over 3 centuries, it remained a political player in African and Atlantic history. When you hear people say Africa had no governments, no cities, no politics, remember Mbanza Congo. Remember the Mani Kongo. Remember a time when Central Africa was not ruled from afar, but from within. And while Congo stood in the heart of the continent, to the west, a different kind of glory was rising, of walls, sculptures, and kingdoms cast in bronze. The mighty Benin Kingdom was entering its golden age. In the rainforests of what is now southern Nigeria, there rose a city so advanced, so organized, so breathtaking in its artistry, that the first Europeans who saw it could barely believe what they were witnessing. This was not fantasy. This was the Kingdom of Benin. Long before the name Nigeria was ever whispered, the Benin Kingdom was a thriving civilization, reaching its golden age in the 1400s under the legendary ruler Oba Iwar the Great, who reigned around 1440 to 1473. Iware was more than a king. He was a visionary city builder, a warrior, and a spiritual reformer. He is remembered as the Oba, who transformed Benin City from a loose collection of settlements into one of the most fortified, artistically rich, and politically sophisticated cities in the world at that time. Benin City wasn't a village. It was an urban wonder, complete with streets wide enough for 4 horses, massive earthworks, and palatial complexes. Its moat and wall system stretched for over 16,000 kilometers, longer than the Great Wall of China, and it was built by black hands. These were not crude defenses. The city's walls were composed of concentric rings of earthworks, expertly engineered with knowledge of hydrology, soil science, and community labor. Homes were laid out in grids, and the city had zoning rules based on social hierarchy and function. At the center of this marvel stood the Oba's royal palace, a complex so large and intricate that early Portuguese explorers likened it to the finest cities in Europe. But beyond its walls and warfare, Benin was a beacon of African art. This was the age when Benin bronzes began to flourish, masterpieces of lost wax casting. Sculptors immortalized kings, warriors, mothers, leopards, and battles in bronze, brass, and ivory. Each piece told a story, carried memory, and preserved power. The Oba held immense authority, but ruled with the aid of a council of chiefs, guilds, and a network of spiritual advisors. Religion was deeply woven into leadership, with rituals honoring ancestors, deities, and natural forces. Benin was not isolated. It maintained diplomatic and trade relations with surrounding African kingdoms, and later, cautiously, with the Portuguese, who arrived in the late 1400s. The people traded pepper, ivory, palm oil, and fine crafts. When Europeans arrived in Benin, they found not savages, but a sovereign state. Not chaos, but civilization. They wrote of a city so clean, so well-governed, so artistically refined, that it challenged every lie they had been told about black people. But centuries later, those same Europeans, led by British imperial ambition, would burn Benin City to the ground in 1897, looting thousands of bronze masterpieces, many of which still sit in European museums today. Yet the legacy remains. Benin is still alive in our skin, our stories, our spirit. The artistry lives on. The walls may have crumbled, but the pride stands tall. In the shadow of Mali's golden age, a new power began to rise. A black African empire with dreams as wide as the desert and ambition as deep as the river that birthed it. This was the Songhai Empire. By the late 1400s, as the Mali Empire's influence began to wane, the Songhai people were building something extraordinary. Centered in the city of Gao, in modern-day Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso. Gao was no ordinary city. It stood tall as a trading powerhouse, where salt, gold, kola nuts, horses, and enslaved people passed hands in bustling markets. The Niger River flowed through it like a lifeline, connecting kingdoms, cultures, and currencies. But Songhai was not just about trade. It was about transformation. At first, Songhai was a regional force under King Suni Ali, a brilliant and feared military leader who reigned from 1464 to 1492. Suni Ali was a conqueror who unified fractured territories and cities, including Timbuktu, which had drifted from Mali's grasp. Suni Ali was controversial, praised by some as a unifier, feared by others for his hard rule and suspicion of Islamic elites. But his achievements were undeniable. He created a professional army with a powerful cavalry. He used riverine forces to patrol the Niger. He established one of the largest empires in African history, stretching from Senegal to western Nigeria. Sunni Ali was no puppet of tradition. He ruled with strategy, force, and a will to elevate Songhai to its rightful place among the world's great empires. After his death in 1492, the same year Columbus arrived in the Americas, Askia Muhammad III seized power. Askia would go on to become one of Africa's greatest rulers, ushering in the golden age of Songhai in the early 1500s. But what made Songhai truly legendary wasn't just its power. It was its commitment to knowledge. Under Askia, Timbuktu and Guinea once again flourished as centers of scholarship. Scholars from across Africa and the Middle East studied law, medicine, theology, astronomy, and philosophy, all taught in Arabic and recorded in thousands of manuscripts. These were not oral traditions alone. This was a literate, learned Africa. Black scholars filled libraries. Black thinkers debated law and science. We were not waiting to be discovered. We were defining ourselves. The Songhai Empire became larger than Mali, more centralized and militarily dominant, one of the greatest African empires ever known. But by the end of the 1500s, Moroccan invasions weakened the empire. Songhai eventually fell, but its legacy echoed for centuries. Let it be known, while Europe crawled toward the Renaissance, Africa was already in motion. We built cities, we led armies, we housed libraries, we charted stars. The Songhai Empire proves our people did not emerge from slavery. We emerged from sovereignty. The river remembers, and so must we. Before the slave ships ever crossed the Atlantic, before the scramble, before the colonies, before the chains, there was Africa, and she was glorious. We've journeyed across centuries and across kingdoms, from the golden libraries of Timbuktu to the towering stone walls of Great Zimbabwe, from the global trade routes of the Swahili coast to the royal court of Congo, the artful brilliance of Benin, and the military might of Songhai. What we've uncovered is a truth long buried under centuries of distortion, that Africa was not waiting to be civilized. She was civilization. They told us our history began with slavery, but history says otherwise. Our story began with kingdoms, with architects, with astronomers, with gold so rich it humbled empires. This was an Africa that built cities with organized governments and roads, traded with India, Persia, and China, studied medicine, astronomy, and law, created art that still stuns the world today, and most of all, this was an Africa that defined herself, an Africa that stood tall, unshackled, proud. We were never broken people. We were broken open, our histories scattered like stars across the sky. But the stars still shine, and now we gather them again. This is not nostalgia. This is reclamation. This is truth. This is Africa Unveiled.